So when we look at the sentences like Mary went to the store, John died, the cat went outside. These are really short sentences and we all make assumptions and we all interpret connections that aren't there. For example, some people assume that Mary and John are married. Some assume that the cat is theirs. Our brains naturally want to connect those, make assumptions, and kind of create a story. Naturally, our brains are wired to do so. And especially when it comes to persuading somebody to see your side, we may not realize that they may not be kind of interpreting things in your own view. They might be making assumptions about things and interpreting them extremely different. And this may kind of affect your ability to persuade somebody to do something. And our brains are hardwired. It's been proven that we like to see in stories. That's how we understand things. It kind of helps provide order in our lives so that we can kind of start to understand things. And research done by Kendall Hayden has shown that this storytelling is actually evolutionary. And before we can actually learn a concept, it needs to make sense. That concept has to make sense to us before we can kind of process it and take it up. And if whatever kind of presentation is disorganized, it doesn't make any sense, we start to make assumptions. And this is our story net actually in action. So there's a thing called the story net, which has been proven by research to exist. And if it is unimportant, if we cannot make sense of it, then we actually disengage. So we start to check our phones. We think about what's going to be for dinner, what's going to be for lunch. We just start disengaging if we can no longer have that idea make sense to us. So Kendall Hayden actually came up with 4 major concepts as to how to make your presentation actually more of a story thing. Because it's on the one hand, very boring to kind of disengage if you're part of the audience, but we always, as presenters, as public speakers, want to make sure that we can strive to make our presentation stories and get better at it. So the 4 major concepts are engagement, transportation, relevance, and influence. So first to start off with, in terms of engagement, this really is about your physical presence and being there with your audience. And with things like pauses in your voice, your tone, your gesture, the eye contact that you make, just your general posture, you really need to make sure that you are engaging and that you as a physical presence in that space are really there with the audience. Now, second, in terms of transportation, we really want to make sure that the audience can kind of be transported and kind of help them visualize what you're talking about. So this can be done in a number of different ways, such as word plays, some kind of different trusts, like pretty much anything that you can imagine. We want to really transport your audience. Third of all, we're going to talk a little bit about relevance. So there has to be some kind of connection between you and your audience. It has to be relevant in some way to them. And that comes along with that engagement. If there's no relevance, even if it's a great story, you're really going to forget about it. So you really have to make sure you're making that connection with the audience. And then fourth of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about influence. So we really want to not only change somebody's behaviors, but really change their attitudes and really change their beliefs, because that is where the root of it all is. And that's essentially what you're trying to change, is their attitudes, their beliefs, what they think. That's what our main goal is. So today we talked a little bit about how our brains analyze in story form through what we call the story net that Kendall Hayden came up with, and how we accept, alter, or kind of reject information, especially if it is not in that story form, and how we really need to make sure that the audience can kind of come up and kind of see your own connections, so that they're not making assumptions, they're not jumping from one thing to another. And in the end, this really helps with the art of persuasion and really getting other people to see your point. So thank you so much.